Elizabeth Morrison's hand trembled as she pressed herself between the loaded pistol and the man she loved, her father's cold gray eyes reflecting 26 years of disappointment and rage. "You want to shoot someone, Judge Morrison? Shoot me first." The courthouse clock struck midnight, exactly 30 days since her father had declared her punishment complete. But this wasn't how it was supposed to end. Warden Kane stumbled backward, his coffee cup shattering against the stone floor as the metallic click of the hammer echoed through the prison yard. "Sweet Jesus, Judge, put that thing down!" 3 federal marshals burst through the wooden gates, their boots thundering against the packed earth, but they were still too far away. Too late. Beth's wedding dress, the one she'd sewn in secret, caught the moonlight as she stood perfectly still, remembering the scared, broken woman who'd arrived here a month ago. That woman would have cowered. This woman would die protecting the innocent man behind her. 30 days ago, I thought my father was sending me to hell, she whispered, never breaking eye contact with the judge. I was wrong. He was sending me home. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The summer heat shimmered off the dusty streets of Redemption Falls, Colorado, where the scent of silver ore and broken dreams hung heavy in the air. Population 847, according to the weathered sign that greeted visitors to this God-forsaken corner of the territory, though most folks reckon that number included the dead buried up on Boot Hill. The territorial penitentiary squatted like a gray stone beast on the town's eastern edge, its shadow falling across the modest homes where decent people tried to forget what lurked behind those walls. Elizabeth Beth Morrison stood at her bedroom window, watching the morning light creep across the valley floor. At 26, she carried herself with the careful posture of a woman who'd learned early that taking up space invited criticism. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, framing intelligent green eyes that held depths most folks never bothered to notice. At 240 pounds, she'd endured 20 years of sideways glances and whispered comments about Judge Morrison's unfortunate daughter, who couldn't seem to catch a husband despite her father's considerable influence. "Much obliged for your kindness," she murmured to her reflection, practicing the words she'd need for another day of polite rejections and disappointed suitors. "But I reckon I'm used to disappointment." The phrase had become her armor, delivered with a gentle smile that hid the ache beneath. Downstairs, Judge Nathaniel Morrison sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing the morning's correspondence with the methodical precision that had made him the most feared and respected man in 3 counties. At 57, he cut an imposing figure, tall, lean, with cold gray eyes that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. To the townspeople, he was the pillar of justice and morality, the man who'd brought law and order to a lawless territory. They didn't know about the locked drawer in his desk or the ledger that detailed payments from grateful parties who'd found his verdicts surprisingly favorable. "When it rains, it pours," he muttered, scanning a particularly troublesome letter from the territorial capital. His gaze drifted to the framed daguerreotype of his late wife, dead these 26 years, from complications birthing the daughter who'd inherited her mother's weakness and ungainly form. Every morning, Elizabeth's presence reminded him of that loss, of the elegant woman who'd been replaced by this disappointing creature who couldn't even manage the simple task of securing a respectable marriage. 3 miles away, behind the stone walls that had contained him for 37 months, Jacob Jake McAllister sat on his narrow cot, watching the sunrise paint the cell bars gold. At 34, prison had weathered his face and grayed his temples, but couldn't diminish the quiet dignity that made even the hardest criminals seek his counsel. His hands, scarred from years of ranch work and more recent prison labor, turned the pages of a worn Bible with surprising gentleness. "A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush," he whispered, reading the margin notes he'd written during sleepless nights. The other inmates called him preacher, though Jake had never claimed any calling beyond the simple faith that had sustained him through 3 years of proclaiming his innocence to deaf ears. The delicate china cup slipped from Beth's trembling fingers like a dying bird, its descent marking the end of 26 years of careful obedience. The crash echoed through the Morrison dining room with the finality of a judge's gavel, shards of great-grandmother Thornfield's finest porcelain scattering across the Persian rug like broken promises. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, wife of the territory's wealthiest silver mine owner, gasped and pressed her gloved hand to her throat, her pale blue eyes wide with the kind of horrified fascination reserved for public executions and social disasters. "Elizabeth!" Judge Morrison's voice cut through the sudden silence like a blade through silk. The Sunday afternoon gathering, 12 of Redemption Fall's most prominent families, turned as one to witness the spectacle, their faces a mixture of shock, sympathy, and barely concealed delight at having front-row seats to the Morrison family's latest embarrassment. Beth dropped to her knees among the porcelain fragments, her face burning with shame as she attempted to gather the pieces of the irreplaceable heirloom. "I'm so sorry, Father. Mrs. Pemberton, please forgive me. I don't know how—" "Don't touch it." Morrison's command froze her mid-reach. He rose from his chair with the deliberate slowness of a man whose authority had never been questioned, his gray eyes reflecting the cold fury that had sent more than one man to the gallows. "Stand up, Elizabeth, now!" The silence stretched like a noose as Beth struggled to her feet, her dark green dress dampened with spilled tea and her face flushed with mortification. Around the table, the town's elite watched with the rapt attention of spectators at a hanging, some pretending to study their teacups, while others stared openly at this latest confirmation of their hostess's inadequacy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the formal cadence he used when pronouncing sentence, "I apologize for this display. My daughter has struggled her entire life with the twin sins of clumsiness and gluttony, and today you've witnessed the inevitable result of my failed attempts at correction." Mrs. Pemberton dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from sympathy or suppressed laughter, Beth couldn't tell. "Oh, Judge Morrison, surely you're being too harsh. These things happen." "No, madam. They do not happen in civilized households where discipline and self-control are properly maintained." Morrison's gaze never left his daughter's face as he continued his public execution. "Elizabeth has enjoyed every comfort, every advantage of education and refinement that money can provide. Yet she remains unmarried at 26, a burden to this household and a disappointment to the family name." The words hit Beth like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. She'd heard variations of this speech before, but never in front of the entire social hierarchy of Redemption Falls, never with such calculated cruelty. "I have reached a decision," Morrison announced, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for death sentences. "Elizabeth requires correction that I have been unable to provide. She needs to learn the value of discipline, the consequence of carelessness, and the meaning of true hardship." Beth's heart began to race as murmurs rippled through the assembled guests. Whatever her father had planned, his public pronouncement meant there would be no reprieve, no private discussion where she might plead for mercy. "Effective tomorrow morning," Morrison continued, "Elizabeth will serve 30 days of supervised domestic service under the direct authority of prisoner Jacob McAllister at the Territorial Penitentiary." The announcement hit the room like a thunderclap. Teacups rattled against saucers as ladies gasped in unison. Mr. Pemberton's monocle dropped from his eye, and Reverend Blackwood's face went pale as cemetery marble. Even the servants, who'd been pretending not to listen from the doorway, couldn't suppress their shocked exclamations. "Good Lord, Nathaniel," Pemberton sputtered. Surely you can't be serious. McAllister is a convicted murderer." "Indeed he is," Morrison replied with satisfaction, "sentenced to 15 years for the brutal killing of Thomas Whitmore. If Elizabeth wishes to behave like an animal, she can learn what it means to live among them." Beth felt the world tilting beneath her feet as the full horror of her father's pronouncement sank in. 30 days. 30 days in the company of a man convicted of murder, away from everything familiar and safe, subjected to whatever twisted justice her father had arranged. "Father, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the scandalized murmur of the guests. "I'll do better. I'll be more careful, I promise." "Your promises have proven worthless, Elizabeth." Morrison's voice carried no trace of paternal affection, only the cold satisfaction of a judge who'd found the perfect punishment to fit the crime. "Perhaps when you return, if you return, you'll have learned the value of the comfortable life you've taken for granted." The room erupted in a cacophony of shocked voices as Beth stood frozen in the ruins of her old life, understanding with crystal clarity that her father hadn't just sentenced her to 30 days of punishment. He'd sentenced her to a reckoning that would change everything. The iron gates of the territorial penitentiary clanged shut behind Beth with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing her into a world she'd only glimpsed in her worst nightmares. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the razor wire as Warden Cornelius Kane led her across the dusty yard, his boots crunching on gravel that had been stained with too much blood and too many tears. Prisoners in striped uniforms paused in their labor to stare at the spectacle, a well-dressed woman walking voluntarily into hell. "I reckon you didn't choose to be here, Miss Morrison," came a voice from behind the bars of cell block 7, and Beth turned to see the man who would be her keeper for the next 30 days. Jacob McAllister stood 6 feet 2 inches in worn prison garb, his dark hair touched with premature gray, and his weathered hands gripping the cold iron bars. But it was his eyes that stopped Beth's breath. Not the cold, calculating gaze of a killer, but something infinitely gentler, filled with a compassion that seemed impossible in this place of broken men and shattered dreams. Beth had prepared herself for violence, for crude demands and degrading treatment. Her father had made it clear that McAllister was a brutal murderer who would teach her the harsh lessons of survival among society's dregs. Instead, she found herself looking into the face of a man who seemed more scholar than savage, more protector than predator. I suppose I didn't," she managed, her voice barely a whisper as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. Around them, the prison yard buzzed with activity as guards herded inmates to their work details, but Beth felt suspended in a bubble of unreality where nothing made sense. Warden Kane unlocked the cell door with unnecessary force, the metal screaming in protest. "McAllister, meet your new assistant. Judge Morrison's arranged for his daughter to learn some discipline under your supervision. 30 days of cooking, cleaning, and whatever other domestic duties you see fit to assign." Jake stepped back as Beth entered the small space that would be her world, his movements careful and deliberate. The cell was Spartanly clean, with 2 narrow bunks, a small table, and a single window that let in bars of golden light. Someone had hung a curtain across one corner, creating a private area that Beth realized with growing amazement had been prepared for her arrival. "Warden," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying an educated cadence that seemed at odds with his rough surroundings. "I'll need assurance that Miss Morrison will be treated with proper respect by the other inmates and guards." Kane's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "You're in no position to make demands, McAllister. The lady wanted equality. Now she's got it." "Welcome to paradise, Miss Morrison." As the warden's footsteps faded down the corridor, Beth found herself alone with a convicted murderer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She'd expected immediate assault, degradation, the fulfillment of her father's darkest warnings. Instead, Jake moved to the small table where a simple meal had been laid out: cornbread, beans, and coffee that actually smelled decent. "I expect you're hungry after your journey," he said, pulling out the single chair and gesturing for her to sit. "It ain't much, but it's honest food." Beth remained standing, her back pressed against the stone wall as she tried to reconcile this gentle courtesy with everything she'd been told about the man before her. "Mr. McAllister, my father said you were dangerous, that you killed a man in cold blood." Something flickered across Jake's face. Pain, perhaps, or the shadow of old grief. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the barred window where dust motes danced in the afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of unanswered protests. "Your father says a lot of things, Miss Beth. Some of them might even be true." He turned to face her, and she was startled by the absence of malice in his expression. "But I reckon you'll have to decide for yourself what kind of man I am. Actions speak louder than words, my mama always said." The gentleness in his voice was so unexpected that Beth felt tears prick at her eyes. When had anyone last spoken to her without judgment, without the underlying disappointment that had colored every interaction with her father? This man, this convicted killer, was treating her with more courtesy than she'd received in her own home. "I don't understand," she whispered, finally accepting the offered chair. "You're supposed to be, that is, Father said." "I know what your father said." Jake settled onto the opposite bunk, maintaining a respectful distance that somehow felt more protective than threatening. 3 years I've been telling folks the truth about what happened that night, and 3 years they've been choosing not to believe me. Maybe that's just the way of things." He reached for a worn Bible that sat on the small shelf beside his bunk, its pages soft with handling. "But I learned something in here, Miss Beth. Truth has a way of rising to the surface, like cream in fresh milk. It might take time, but it always finds a way." As the evening shadows lengthened across the cell floor, Beth began to understand that everything she'd believed about this place, about this man, about her father's version of justice, might be as fragile as great-grandmother Thornfield's china. And just like that precious porcelain, once shattered, it could never be made whole again. The question that haunted her as darkness fell was whether the breaking would destroy her or set her free. The first week passed like a fever dream of contradictions that left Beth questioning everything she'd believed about justice, punishment, and the nature of good men. Each dawn brought the harsh clang of the prison bell at 5 o'clock, followed by Jake's gentle voice calling her name through the curtain that separated their sleeping areas. "Miss Beth, coffee's ready when you are, ma'am." No man had ever prepared her coffee before. Her father considered such domestic tasks beneath his dignity, and the household servants had always maintained the proper distance between employer and employee. But here was a convicted murderer, supposedly the most dangerous kind of man, ensuring she had warm bread and hot coffee before he took so much as a sip for himself. It made no sense according to the world she'd known, yet it was happening every single morning with the reliability of sunrise. The prison kitchen became their shared domain, a cavernous space filled with enormous pots and the constant steam of institutional cooking. Jake moved through it with surprising grace, his large hands surprisingly gentle, as he taught Beth the art of feeding 200 men on a budget that wouldn't have covered one of her father's dinner parties. "The secret," he explained, while showing her how to stretch a pot of beans with carefully rationed bacon, "is remembering that every man in here is somebody's son. Maybe they made mistakes. Maybe they're paying for crimes they didn't commit. But they all deserve to eat like human beings." Beth watched him work, noting how the other prisoners responded to his presence. They didn't fear Jake McAllister. They respected him. Men twice his size deferred to his quiet authority, and she witnessed countless small acts of kindness. Jake sharing his tobacco ration with a young prisoner who'd received no mail, mediating disputes with wisdom that seemed far beyond his years, reading letters aloud for inmates who couldn't manage the words themselves. "What kind of murderer teaches Sunday school?" she asked one evening, as Jake whittled wooden toys for the local orphanage, his scarred hands creating delicate angels and horses with infinite patience. Jake's knife paused in its work, and for a moment the only sound was the distant echo of guards making their rounds. "The kind who ain't actually a murderer, I reckon," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of sorrow that made Beth's chest ache. "But that's not for me to say. Courts decided otherwise." The second week brought a violent thunderstorm that trapped them in the cell while rain hammered against the barred window like nature's own percussion. Beth had been terrified of thunderstorms since childhood, when lightning had struck the old oak outside her bedroom window, splitting it in half with a sound like the world ending. As thunder crashed overhead, she found herself trembling despite her best efforts to appear composed. Without a word, Jake began to speak in the darkness, his voice weaving stories of his childhood on a ranch outside Denver, of horses that could read the weather in a man's bones and cattle drives under star-filled skies. His words painted pictures that made her forget the storm raging outside, and when she finally relaxed enough to listen properly, she realized he was describing a world of simple beauty that her pampered life had never touched. "I had a sister once," he said, during a lull in the storm, his voice soft with memory. "Sarah Marie. She was about your age when the fever took her. Had eyes like yours, green as spring grass and twice as bright." She deserved better than what this world gave her. The pain in his voice was so raw that Beth felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. McAllister." "Jake," he corrected gently. "And I'm sorry for yours too, Miss Beth." She looked at him in confusion. "My loss?" "The loss of being seen for who you really are instead of who folks think you should be." His words hit her like a physical blow, exposing truths she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Takes a special kind of blindness to look at a woman with your heart and your mind and see only disappointment. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, as if she were valuable, worthy of respect and admiration. The tears came harder then, months of suppressed grief and loneliness pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. Jake didn't try to touch her or offer empty comfort. He simply sat nearby, a steady presence in the storm-darkened cell, letting her cry until she was empty. The third week brought unexpected visitors in the form of letters that arrived for Jake through channels Beth couldn't understand. She glimpsed one by accident when it fell from his Bible, written in a woman's careful script and signed M. Whitmore. The name struck her like lightning. Thomas Whitmore, the man Jake was supposed to have murdered. But if Whitmore was dead, who was M. Whitmore? And why was she writing to his killer? "Jake," Beth said carefully that evening as they shared their simple supper, "I saw the letter today. From Mrs. Whitmore. I don't understand." Jake's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and she saw something flicker across his face. Fear, maybe, or the kind of careful calculation that came from 3 years of navigating dangerous waters. "Some truths are too dangerous for good folks, Miss Beth. Sometimes knowing things can get people hurt." But Beth had tasted too much truth to go back to comfortable lies. "The woman whose husband you killed is writing you letters. That doesn't make sense unless—" The pieces began fitting together in her mind like fragments of a puzzle she'd been unknowingly solving. "Unless you didn't kill him at all." Jake set down his spoon and looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to fathom. "What do you think happened that night, Miss Beth? What story did your father tell?" Beth recited the version she'd heard whispered in parlors and printed in the territorial newspapers. Jake McAllister, drifter and ranch hand, had broken into the Whitmore house to rob it. When Thomas Whitmore confronted him, Jake had beaten the respected rancher to death with his bare hands, stealing money and jewelry before fleeing into the night. Only quick work by Judge Morrison and the territorial marshals had brought the killer to justice. "That's a fine story," Jake said when she finished. "Clean, simple. Makes everybody feel safe in their beds at night." He stood and walked to the barred window, his silhouette dark against the evening sky. "Truth is messier. Truth is that Thomas Whitmore was beating his wife to death when I rode up to their house that night. Truth is that I fought him to save her life, and when he died, his family paid good money to make sure I took the blame." The words hit Beth like physical blows. "You're saying my father knowingly convicted an innocent man?" "I'm saying your father knows which side his bread is buttered on, and the Whitmore family owns a lot of bakeries." Jake turned back to face her, and in the fading light she could see the exhaustion that 3 years of imprisonment had carved into his features. "Margaret Whitmore writes to me because she feels guilty. She was too scared to testify on my behalf, and now she can't sleep at night, knowing an innocent man is paying for her husband's crimes." Beth felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as her understanding of justice, of her father's integrity, of the very foundations of her world began to crumble. Why didn't she speak up? Why doesn't she speak up now? Because the Whitmores promised to kill her if she ever told the truth. Because your father made it clear that her testimony wouldn't be believed anyway, because sometimes the system protects the wrong people and good folks get crushed underneath it. The 4th week brought a dangerous shift in their relationship as Beth found herself seeing Jake not as her captor or her punishment, but as the gentlest, most honorable man she'd ever known. He never took more food than she did, despite being twice her size and doing heavy labor all day. He shared his single blanket when the nights turned cold, sleeping on the stone floor without complaint. He listened to her read aloud from books with the attention of a scholar, asked thoughtful questions, and shared insights that revealed an education far beyond what any ranch hand should possess. "You weren't always a ranch hand, were you?" she asked one evening as he helped her with a difficult passage from Shakespeare that she'd borrowed from the prison chaplain. Jake smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him. "I studied for the ministry once upon a time, seminary in Denver, before my father's ranch went under, and I had to come home to help support the family. Always figured I'd go back someday, finish what I started." "Why didn't you tell people? At your trial, I mean. An educated man, a seminary student, surely that would have helped your case." "Might have, if anybody had been interested in hearing it. But the story was already written by then, Miss Beth. All they needed was someone to play the part of the villain, and I was convenient." Beth felt her heart breaking for this man who had lost everything, his freedom, his future, his calling, to protect a woman he barely knew. "You gave up your whole life to save a stranger. Wouldn't you have done the same?" Jake asked simply. "If you'd seen someone helpless being hurt, wouldn't you have tried to help?" The question haunted Beth because she realized with painful clarity that she'd never been brave enough to help anyone, had never even been brave enough to help herself. But being here, learning from Jake's quiet strength and moral courage, she felt something awakening in her soul, a sense of purpose she'd never known existed. On the 28th day, as their time together drew to a close, Beth made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find Margaret Whitmore, get her testimony, and prove Jake's innocence. The thought terrified her, but Jake had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what was right despite the fear. What she didn't know was that her father had been watching, waiting, and planning something far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. The morning of day 29 dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the prison walls like a living thing. Beth woke to find Jake already dressed and standing at their small, barred window, his shoulders tense with a wariness she'd never seen before. The usual sounds of prison life, guards calling orders, inmates shuffling to work details, the clang of metal doors, seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened with approaching danger. "Something's wrong," Jake said without turning around, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect from hardened criminals and gentle souls alike. "Been watching the yard since before dawn. Too many guards, too much whispering. Your father's planning something, Miss Beth, and I don't reckon it's anything good." Beth felt ice water flood her veins as she joined him at the window. Sure enough, the prison yard swarmed with more guards than she'd ever seen, their faces grim and their hands resting meaningfully on their weapons. Warden Kane stood near the main gate in heated conversation with two men she didn't recognize, federal marshals by their dress and bearing. But it was the third figure that made her blood freeze. Judge Nathaniel Morrison himself, arriving a full day before her sentence was due to end. "He's come early," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Father never does anything without a reason." Jake turned to face her, and she saw in his dark eyes the same look she'd witnessed in Cornered Animals. Not fear exactly, but the grim recognition of a predator closing in. "I need you to listen carefully, Beth. Whatever happens today, whatever your father says or does, I need you to remember that you're stronger than you know. These past weeks, watching you grow into yourself, seeing you stand up straighter and speak with your own voice, that's the real you. Don't let him take that away." Before Beth could respond, the heavy footsteps of approaching guards echoed down the corridor. The key turned in their cell door with an finality that made her stomach clench, and Warden Kane entered with Judge Morrison and the two federal marshals. Her father looked exactly as he always did, immaculate in his black coat, silver hair perfectly groomed, gray eyes cold as winter steel. But there was something else in his expression today, a satisfaction that made Beth's skin crawl. "Elizabeth," Morrison said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used in court, "I trust your month of education has been enlightening. You look different." It was true. Beth could feel it in the way she held herself, in the steadiness of her gaze as she met her father's stare without flinching. She'd lost weight, certainly, but more than that, she'd found something she hadn't even known was missing, a sense of her own worth that didn't depend on his approval or anyone else's. "It has been enlightening, Father," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "More than you could possibly imagine." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her, taking in the small changes that marked her transformation. The way she stood beside Jake without cowering, the absence of the apologetic hunch that had characterized her posture for 26 years, the new confidence in her voice, it was all wrong, all contrary to what this punishment was supposed to accomplish. "Marshal Harrison, Marshal Webb," Morrison said, gesturing to the federal officers, "I'd like you to meet the prisoner who's been corrupting my daughter, Jacob McAllister, convicted murderer and now, it seems, seducer of innocent women." The accusation hit the cell like a physical blow. Beth felt Jake tense beside her, his hands clenching into fists before he forced them to relax. She knew him well enough now to recognize the supreme self-control it took for him to remain calm in the face of such vicious lies. "Judge Morrison," Marshal Harrison said, consulting a document in his hands, "we've received some interesting correspondence regarding Mr. McAllister's case. It seems there may have been irregularities in his conviction." For the first time since entering the cell, Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "Irregularities? I'm sure I don't know what you mean. The case was thoroughly investigated and properly adjudicated." That's what we're here to determine, Marshal Webb added, his keen eyes moving between Morrison and Jake. We've had reports suggesting that key evidence was suppressed and witnesses were intimidated, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore has requested federal protection so she can testify about what really happened the night her husband died. The color drained from Morrison's face so quickly that Beth thought he might collapse. She watched her father, the man she'd feared and revered her entire life, struggle to maintain his facade as the walls of his carefully constructed lies began to crumble around him. Mrs. Whitmore is clearly unstable, Morrison said, but his voice had lost its usual commanding tone. Grief has affected her judgment. Any testimony she might offer would be unreliable at best. We'll let a jury decide that, Marshal Harrison replied coolly. In the meantime, we're here to transfer Mr. McAllister to federal custody pending a new investigation. Jake stepped forward, his movement careful and non-threatening. Marshals, I appreciate your efforts, but I need you to understand something. Judge Morrison isn't just corrupt. He's dangerous. He's got too much to lose if the truth comes out, and he'll do anything to protect himself. As if summoned by Jake's words, the sound of gunfire erupted from the prison yard. Shouts and screams echoed through the stone corridors as chaos descended on the penitentiary. Through the barred window, Beth could see inmates scattering in panic while guards ran toward some unseen emergency. "What in the hell?" Warden Kane started to say, but his words were cut off as the cell door slammed shut behind them. The sound of the key turning in the lock made everyone freeze. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans," Morrison said. And when Beth turned to look at him, she saw a small Derringer pistol in his hand. A prison riot is such a dangerous thing. Innocent people get caught in the crossfire. Tragic accidents happen. Regrettably, sometimes even federal marshals don't make it out alive. Marshal Webb reached for his weapon, but Morrison was faster than his age suggested. "I wouldn't recommend that, Marshal. You see, I've spent 3 years planning for this possibility. The riot isn't random, it's my insurance policy. By the time it's over, any inconvenient witnesses will be dead, and the official report will show that Jacob McAllister was killed while attempting to escape." Beth felt the world tilting beneath her feet as she realized the full scope of her father's plan. He hadn't come to collect her early. He'd come to eliminate Jake and anyone else who might threaten his position. The federal investigation, Margaret Whitmore's testimony, Jake's potential freedom, it would all die here in this cell, buried under the chaos of a manufactured riot. "And what about me, Father?" Beth asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "What happens to your disappointing daughter in this tragic accident?" Morrison's gray eyes met hers with a coldness that made her blood freeze. "You should have learned your lesson, Elizabeth. You should have come home grateful for your comfortable life and eager to marry the Boston widower I've arranged for you. Instead, you've allowed this criminal to poison your mind against your own family." Jake moved almost imperceptibly, positioning himself between Beth and her father's gun. "Let her go, Judge. This is between you and me. She's your daughter. Surely she means more to you than protecting your reputation." Morrison's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "My daughter died the day her mother did. This creature has been nothing but a reminder of weakness and failure ever since." He raised the pistol, his hand steady despite his 67 years. "At least now she'll finally serve a useful purpose." The gunshot that followed echoed through the cell like thunder, and Beth's scream joined the chaos erupting throughout the prison as the carefully ordered world she'd known exploded into violence and betrayal. Blood splattered against the stone walls, and in that moment of perfect horror, she understood that everything, absolutely everything, was about to change forever. The gunshot echoed through the stone cell like the crack of doom itself, and for one terrible moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Beth's world became nothing but the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic taste of terror on her tongue. Time moved like molasses as she watched Jake's body jerk backward, his white prison shirt blooming crimson across the shoulder where her father's bullet had found its mark. "Jake!" Beth's scream tore from her throat as she lunged forward, catching him as he stumbled against the cell wall. Blood seeped between her fingers as she pressed her hands against the wound, feeling the warmth of his life spilling out onto the cold stone floor. His face had gone pale as winter moonlight, but his dark eyes remained fixed on hers with an intensity that spoke of things left unsaid. "Miss Beth," he whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word, "don't you give up on yourself." "Don't let him win." Marshal Harrison and Webb had drawn their weapons the moment Morrison fired, but the confined space of the cell made any return fire impossible without risking Beth's life. The federal officers crouched behind the narrow bunks, their faces grim as they assessed the situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. "Put the gun down, Judge," Marshal Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "You've just shot an unarmed man in front of federal witnesses. There's no way back from this." Morrison's laugh was the sound of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed around him, leaving nothing but the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Back? There was never any going back the moment that Whitmore woman decided to grow a conscience. "Do you think I've spent 30 years building my reputation just to watch it crumble because of one weak woman's testimony?" Blood continued to flow from Jake's shoulder, staining Beth's dress and pooling on the floor beneath them. She could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat, could see the life fading from his eyes even as he fought to stay conscious. The man who had shown her kindness when the world offered only cruelty, who had taught her to see her own worth when everyone else saw only failure, was dying in her arms because of her father's greed and pride. "Please," Beth whispered, not to her father, but to whatever merciful God might be listening in this place of stone and suffering. "Don't take him. Not now. Not like this." The sounds of the manufactured riot continued to echo through the prison corridors, shouts, running footsteps, the crash of overturned furniture. Warden Kane had pressed himself against the cell door, his face a mask of barely contained panic as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered by Morrison's planning. The corrupt judge had orchestrated this chaos as cover for murder, and now they were all trapped in the deadly web of his desperation. "Father, stop this madness," Beth pleaded, looking up from Jake's bleeding form to meet Morrison's cold gray eyes. "He's dying. You've won. Isn't that enough?" "Enough?" Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Nothing will be enough until every threat to my position is eliminated. That includes you, my dear daughter, since you've proven yourself incapable of loyalty to your own family." Jake stirred in Beth's arms, his hand reaching weakly toward the small wooden cross he always kept in his shirt pocket. Even bleeding and dying, he was trying to offer her comfort, trying to remind her of the faith that had sustained him through 3 years of wrongful imprisonment. The sight of his gentle courage in the face of death broke something fundamental inside her chest. "You want to know about loyalty, Father?" Beth said, her voice growing stronger even as Jake's grew weaker. "This man, this supposedly dangerous criminal, has shown me more respect and kindness in 30 days than you've shown me in 26 years. He's protected me, taught me, helped me find my own strength. If that's not loyalty, if that's not love, then I don't know what is." Morrison's face twisted with rage at his daughter's words. "Love? You think this killer loves you? Look at yourself, Elizabeth. You're a fat, unmarriageable burden who thinks a desperate criminal's attention is the same as affection. He's using you, just like everyone uses everyone else in this world." "No," Beth said quietly. And for the first time in her life, she felt the absolute certainty of truth flowing through her veins like liquid fire. "You're wrong about him, and you're wrong about me." Jake sees me as God made me, worth loving, worth protecting, worth dying for. That's more than you've ever given me." Jake's breathing was becoming shallower, his skin growing cold beneath her touch. Blood loss was taking its inevitable toll, and Beth could see in his eyes the knowledge that time was running out. The riot sounds from the corridor were growing louder, closer, as Morrison's carefully planned chaos reached its crescendo. "Goodbye, Miss Beth," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of violence. "Remember what I taught you about truth. It always rises to the surface." The world crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity as Beth felt Jake's pulse growing weaker beneath her trembling fingers. His breathing had become shallow and labored, each breath a struggle against the darkness that was claiming him inch by inch. Blood continued to seep from the shoulder wound, and she knew with devastating certainty that without immediate medical attention, the man who had shown her what love truly meant would die in her arms. "No," she whispered, then louder, with a strength that surprised even her. "No. I will not let you die, Jacob McAllister. Do you hear me?" Something flickered in Jake's fading eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at the steel in her voice. With tremendous effort, he lifted his uninjured hand to touch her cheek, his fingers leaving a smear of his own blood on her skin. "Beth," he breathed, "listen to me. Behind the loose stone, third from the corner, Margaret's letters, the truth about that night." Promise you'll what?" Morrison snarled, still holding the smoking derringer. "That she'll waste her life pursuing fairy tales? Elizabeth, step away from him this instant. The man is a convicted killer and you're making a spectacle of yourself." But Beth didn't move. Instead, she did something that would have been unthinkable just 30 days ago. She looked her father directly in the eye and spoke with the quiet authority she'd learned from Jake. "The only killer in this room is you, Father, and I'm done being afraid of you." The transformation in Morrison's face was immediate and chilling. The mask of civilized respectability fell away completely, revealing the cold-blooded calculation beneath. "You ungrateful little fool! Do you think anyone will believe your word against mine? A fat, hysterical spinster defending a murderer. I'll have you declared mentally incompetent before you can draw breath to speak." "That won't be necessary, Judge," came a new voice from the cell doorway, and everyone turned to see Dr. Samuel Hayes, the prison physician, flanked by 2 more federal marshals. "We heard the gunshot from the infirmary. Marshal Harrison's signal brought us running." Beth's heart leaped with hope as Dr. Hayes rushed to Jake's side, his experienced hands immediately assessing the wound with professional efficiency. "Bullet's still in there, but it missed the major arteries. He's lost blood, but he's not dying today if I have anything to say about it." "Doctor," Morrison began, his voice taking on the smooth authority that had served him so well in courtrooms, "I'm afraid there's been a terrible accident during the riot. This prisoner attempted to assault my daughter, and I was forced to defend her." Dr. Hayes looked up from his examination of Jake's wound, his weathered face skeptical. "Funny thing about that, Judge. See, I've been treating prisoners in this facility for 15 years, and I've learned to read the signs of violence pretty well. This man's been shot from 6 feet away while standing still. No struggle, no defensive wounds, no signs of aggression at all." Marshal Webb stepped forward, his notebook already out. "Dr. Hayes, we'll need you to document everything for the federal investigation. Judge Morrison is now under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and corruption of justice." The words hit Morrison like physical blows. His face went through a rapid series of changes: shock, denial, rage, and finally a kind of desperate cunning that Beth recognized from her childhood. He was planning something, calculating his next move with the cold precision that had made him such an effective manipulator. "You're making a grave mistake, Marshals," Morrison said, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "I am a federal judge with 30 years of distinguished service. My word carries weight in territorial courtrooms from here to Washington. This prisoner has clearly bewitched my mentally fragile daughter, and any testimony she might offer would be the ravings of a woman whose judgment has been compromised by an obvious infatuation with her captor." Beth felt something snap inside her chest. Not break, but snap into place like the final piece of a complex puzzle. For 26 years, she'd allowed her father's words to define her reality, to make her believe she was weak, worthless, undeserving of love or respect. But Jake had shown her a different truth, and now she had the strength to speak it. "My name is Elizabeth Morrison," she said, rising to her feet with dignity that would have made Jake proud. "I am 26 years old, of sound mind and body, and I am done being silent while evil men destroy innocent lives." She turned to face the federal marshals directly. "Everything my father just said is a lie. Jacob McAllister is innocent of murder. My father has been taking bribes for years, and I have witnessed him attempt to kill an unarmed man to cover up his crimes." Dr. Hayes had been working quickly while she spoke, applying pressure bandages and preparing Jake for transport to the infirmary. "Miss Morrison," he said gently, "your friend here is stable for now, but he needs surgery to remove that bullet. Are you strong enough to help me get him to the medical ward?" "I'm strong enough," Beth replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She had found her strength in the most unlikely place, learned her worth from the most unlikely teacher, and discovered that love could indeed conquer even the darkest circumstances. As they prepared to move Jake, he caught her hand with his good one. "Beth," he whispered, "behind the stone. Margaret's letters. They'll prove everything." She nodded, understanding flooding through her. The loose stone in their cell wall, the hiding place where Jake had kept his most precious possession, the correspondence from the woman whose life he'd saved and whose testimony would free him, the truth that would rise to the surface at last, just as he'd always said it would. "Marshal Harrison," Beth called as they lifted Jake onto a makeshift stretcher. "In our cell, behind the third loose stone from the corner, you'll find letters from Margaret Whitmore that prove Mr. McAllister's innocence and my father's guilt." Morrison made one last desperate lunge toward the cell door, but Marshal Webb was ready for him. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was the sweetest music Beth had ever heard. The sound of justice finally being served, of truth finally being acknowledged, of love finally being enough to overcome the lies that had held them all prisoner. As they carried Jake toward the infirmary, Beth walking beside the stretcher and holding his hand, she realized that her father had been wrong about everything. She wasn't weak or worthless or undeserving of love. She was strong enough to fight for the truth, brave enough to stand up to evil, and worthy of a love that had been willing to die for her. The man she'd thought was her punishment had become her salvation, and the woman she'd thought was broken had discovered she was actually just beginning to live. 3 months later, the small wooden church of Redemption Falls had never seen a wedding quite like the one that brought together Elizabeth Morrison and Jacob McAllister on a crisp October morning when the aspen leaves painted the mountainsides gold and crimson. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and new beginnings as townspeople filled the simple pews, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, genuine happiness, and the grudging respect that comes when people are forced to confront their own prejudices. Beth stood at the altar in a dress of ivory silk that she had sewn herself during Jake's recovery, her auburn hair crowned with a simple wreath of mountain wildflowers. The woman who gazed lovingly at her groom bore little resemblance to the frightened, shame-faced creature who had been delivered to the prison gates 4 months earlier. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her green eyes bright with confidence and purpose, her smile radiant with the joy of a woman who had finally found her true home. Jake waited for her at the altar, handsome in a new black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his left arm still bearing the slight stiffness that reminded them both of the bullet that had nearly ended their story before it could truly begin. The scars of his wrongful imprisonment would always mark him, the gray in his temples, the lines around his eyes, the careful way he moved through crowds. But they were scars of survival, of integrity, maintained in the face of injustice, of a man who had emerged from hell with his soul intact. Reverend Blackwood, the same minister who had sat silent at Judge Morrison's dinner table during Beth's public humiliation, now spoke the words that would bind them together with visible emotion in his voice. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but redemption. Their journey to this altar has been marked by trials that would have broken lesser spirits, but instead have forged them into something stronger than either could have been alone. Among the guests sat Margaret Whitmore, the woman whose courage had finally broken the chains of fear and corruption that had bound them all. Her testimony before the federal grand jury had not only secured Jake's complete exoneration, but had exposed a network of judicial corruption that reached far beyond Redemption Falls. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she watched the man who had saved her life pledge his heart to the woman who had saved his soul. The federal investigation had unraveled Judge Morrison's crimes with methodical thoroughness, revealing a pattern of bribery, witness intimidation, and judicial misconduct that spanned nearly a decade. The ledger found in his locked desk drawer detailed payments from wealthy defendants, arrangements with corrupt businessmen, and the systematic perversion of justice for personal gain. Morrison himself now resided in the same territorial prison where he had sent Jake, though his cell lacked the dignity and purpose that Jake had brought to his wrongful incarceration. "Do you, Jacob McAllister," Reverend Blackwood continued, "take Elizabeth to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" "I do," Jake replied, his voice carrying the same quiet strength that had sustained him through 3 years of imprisonment and the same gentle certainty that had first shown Beth what real love looked like. "With all my heart for all my days, I do." The simple words carried weight beyond their syllables, encompassing the journey that had brought them to this moment, from captor and prisoner to teacher and student to beloved partners in life's greatest adventure. Jake slipped a simple gold band onto Beth's finger, the ring he had purchased with his first honest wages since his release, earned through carpentry work that had quickly made him one of the most sought-after craftsmen in 3 counties. "Do you, Elizabeth Morrison," the Reverend asked, "take Jacob to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" "I do," Beth answered, her voice clear and strong, carrying none of the hesitation or apology that had characterized her speech for so many years. "I take this good man as my husband, my partner, and my dearest friend. I promise to love him as he has taught me to love myself, completely, faithfully, and without reservation." As she placed a matching gold band on Jake's finger, Beth thought of the woman she had been just months ago, cowering before her father's disapproval, accepting cruelty as her due, believing herself unworthy of genuine affection. That woman felt like a stranger now, a shadow from a previous life that had ended the moment Jake McAllister had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. The ceremony continued with readings from Scripture about love, forgiveness, and redemption, themes that resonated deeply with everyone present who had witnessed the extraordinary transformation of both bride and groom. When Reverend Blackwood pronounced them husband and wife, The small church erupted in applause that spoke not just of celebration, but of a community coming to terms with its own capacity for growth and change. Their first home was a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, built with Jake's own hands-on land purchased with the compensation the territorial government had provided for his wrongful conviction. The house was simple but beautiful, with wide windows that let in the mountain light and a large kitchen where Beth could practice the culinary skills she had discovered during her time in the prison. More importantly, it was a place of peace and safety, where love lived openly and without apology. Beth had found her calling as a teacher, starting with reading lessons for the local children and gradually expanding to become an advocate for women's rights and prison reform. Her first-hand experience with the corruption of the justice system had given her a unique perspective and moral authority that made her a powerful voice for change. She spoke at churches and town halls throughout the territory, sharing her story and challenging others to examine their own assumptions about justice, mercy, and human worth. Jake returned to his original calling, completing his theological studies through correspondence and eventually becoming the prison chaplain, a position that allowed him to minister to men in circumstances he understood all too well. His gentle wisdom and unshakable faith made him a beacon of hope for inmates who had given up on redemption, and his practical knowledge of carpentry and farming gave him tools to help them prepare for life beyond the walls. Together they became pillars of their community in ways that neither had ever expected. Their home became a refuge for those in need, former prisoners seeking a fresh start, women escaping abusive situations, children who needed temporary shelter and care. Beth's cooking fed them all. Jake's strong hands built additions to accommodate the growing family of choice they had created, and their love provided the foundation upon which others could rebuild their lives. 1 year after their wedding, as autumn painted the mountains once again, Beth stood in their kitchen preparing Sunday dinner for their extended family. 3 orphan children they had taken in, 2 former prisoners Jake was helping reintegrate into society, and Margaret Whitmore, who had become like a sister to them both. The table was crowded with laughter and conversation, the simple meal elevated by the love that seasoned every dish. Jake came up behind her as she checked the roast in the oven, his arms encircling her waist in the gentle embrace that still made her heart race after all these months. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. McAllister," he murmured against her ear, using the name that never failed to make her smile. "I was thinking about gratitude," Beth replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Thinking about how Father intended my time at the prison to be a punishment, a lesson in humiliation and submission. Instead, it became the greatest gift of my life, not just because I found you, but because I found myself." Jake turned her in his arms so he could see her face, his dark eyes holding all the love and admiration that had first shown her what she was truly worth. "Reckon we both found ourselves in that place," he said softly. "Found out that love isn't about what folks look like or where they come from or what mistakes they've made. It's about seeing the heart of a person and choosing to cherish what you find there." As the sun set over the mountains they called home, Beth Morrison McAllister understood with perfect clarity that every heartbreak, every moment of despair, every cruel word and broken dream had been leading her to this moment, this man, this life filled with purpose and love beyond anything she had ever dared to imagine. Her father had tried to break her spirit, but instead he had set her free to discover that she had been worthy of love all along. She had simply needed to find someone with the wisdom to see it and the courage to claim it. And that, she thought, as Jake's lips found hers in a kiss that tasted of forever, was how an innocent man's love had saved them all. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as our worst punishments. Elizabeth Morrison thought her father was condemning her to hell when he sent her to that prison, but instead she found heaven in the gentle hands of a man who saw her worth when the whole world saw only failure. At 26, She believed she was too old, too flawed, too disappointing to ever find real love. Sound familiar? How many of us have looked in the mirror and believed the cruel voices that told us we weren't enough, thin enough, successful enough, worthy enough of the love we desperately craved? Jake McAllister didn't see Elizabeth's size or her father's disappointment. He saw her heart, her kindness, her strength waiting to bloom. He taught her that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, that real love appreciates what it has instead of wishing for something different. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to find someone who loves us exactly as we are, who sees our scars as proof of our survival, our imperfections as marks of our humanity. Questions for you. When did someone see your true worth before you saw it yourself? What would you tell your younger self about waiting for real love?